Hey everyone, tonight we re-wandering into the quietest corners of the Middle Ages, not the battlefields or cathedrals, but the margins of books where strange things crawled beside sacred words. Imagine it, a monk bent over parchment, in the glow of a trembling candle. Outside, the monastery sleeps. Inside, the air smells of ink, wax and vellum. And on the very edge of a holy manuscript, a tiny armoured knight lowers a lance against a snail. No one knows why. The scene repeats again and again across Europe, in France, in England, in Flanders. Brave knights charging at garden creatures, their banners fluttering, their faces serious beneath gilded halos. The snails are always the same, calm, slow, patient, their spiral shells catching the glint of gold leaf. Sometimes they win, sometimes the knight retreats, always the monk keeps painting. In a world of saints and swords, this was something softer, a whisper of humour in a place that feared laughter. Each snail, each tiny duel was a question painted in silence. Were the snails symbols of cowardly nobles, the Lombards, the slow corruption of time, or were they simply jokes? A quiet smile from someone who had copied prayers for 30 years and needed a moment of mischief. Picture the scene again, the candle guttering, the ink drying, the monk pausing to draw a shell's perfect spiral before the bell tolls for matins. Beyond the walls, snow falls softly over a sleeping village. Inside, in the glow of one flickering light, absurdity and faith share the same page. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you enjoy these gentle pilgrimages through history's strangest dreams. Tell me where you're listening from tonight and what hour it feels like there. Because somewhere, in a forgotten monastery, a snail still crawls through gold ink, carrying its secret across the centuries. Now, close your eyes. Hear the quill scratching, the hush of turning pages, and the faint laughter of monks who dared to paint nonsense beside divinity. Let S begin, the story of the Middle Ages. Strangest obsession, the eternal duel between knight and snail. The rule of the village and the voice of the church. The bell that summoned judgment. The first light of dawn, a pale, bruised grey, had barely begun to paint the eastern sky. For the medieval village, accustomed to the church bell's daily chime, its morning resonance was usually a call to prayer, to work, to the familiar rhythms of agrarian life. But on certain days, shrouded in an unsettling quiet, its voice transformed. At dawn, the church bell rings not for prayer, but for punishment. Its deep, mournful clang echoed across the misty fields, through the narrow cobbled streets. Summoning villagers from their huts, they gathered, cloaks pulled tight against the biting cold, to witness another soul-made example, a profound, chilling ritual of public shame and power, dictating the harsh laws of their land. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, sharp and brutal, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension. The sounds were no longer the cheerful chatter of a waking village. They included the slow, deliberate toll of the bell, the muffled crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, and the low murmur of hushed conversations. The uneasy silence that followed each clang amplified the sense of profound dread as villagers emerged, their faces grim and unyielding, to witness the ritual of justice. The bell, a formidable object hanging high in the church steeple, was not merely a mechanical device, it was imbued with immense spiritual and communal power. Its sound, believed to carry divine authority, commanded obedience, permeated every corner of peasant life. Today its voice was solemn, grave, a stark declaration that the community's fragile order had been disturbed, and retribution was at hand. Listen to the slow, deliberate toll of the bell, its resonance vibrating through the very earth, through the thick walls of your cottage, gripping your heart with a cold, unrelenting dread. Hear the muffled crunch of hobnailed boots or crude wooden clogs on the frozen ground, as families, wrapped in their coarse woolen cloaks, walked towards the village square. See the clusters of villagers, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light, their eyes fixed on the makeshift gallows, the whipping post or the pillory already erected in the centre of the square. Villagers gather, cloaks pulled tight, to witness another soul made example. Attendance was often not voluntary, it was an unspoken obligation, a communal duty. The Lord's Reeve, or the village elders, expected all able-bodied men and women to be present, to absorb the brutal lesson, to reinforce the terrifying power of communal justice. To absent oneself could invite suspicion, or worse, a fine. The square, usually a bustling hub of commerce and social interaction, was now transformed into a stage for the brutal theatre of punishment. The cold, crisp air would amplify the sounds of the proceedings. The stern voice of the judge, the cries of the accused, the eventual crack of the whip, or the thud of the executioner's axe. Every detail was designed to be memorable, a visceral warning to all who watched. The church bell rings not for prayer, but for punishment. This was a profound perversion of its usual sacred function. Its call, usually a path to spiritual comfort, now led to public shame and physical pain. It underscored the church's pervasive power, its role in enforcing not just divine law, but social order, blending the sacred with the secular in a chilling display of authority. The psychological impact was immense. To witness such a public spectacle, to see a neighbor, a friend, or even a relative stripped of their dignity, subjected to pain and humiliation, was a crushing burden. It instilled a profound, pervasive fear of transgression, a constant awareness of the strict, unforgiving laws that governed their lives. At dawn, the church bell rings not for prayer, but for punishment. The bell that summoned judgment was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of the church, where humiliation was often the law, and every toll carried the weight of life and death. The law of the churchyard. In the profoundly religious world of medieval peasants, where sin and salvation were terrifyingly real, the church's authority permeated every aspect of life, extending even beyond the confines of Sunday Mass. The law of the churchyard was a powerful, chilling reality. Confession is no refuge when the priest's word carries the weight of law. A whisper in the confessional, intended for God's ears alone, could lead to a lifetime of penance, or a public lash transforming spiritual guidance into a profound tool of social control and shaping their moral choices with an ever-present fear of divine and earthly retribution. Imagine the air thick with the subtle scent of old stone, beeswax candles, and the lingering aroma of incense mingled with the faint tang of fear and penitence. The sounds were no longer the simple toll of the judgment bell. They included the low murmur of whispered sins, the solemn voice of the priest, and the rustle of woolen cloaks as peasants waited anxiously for their turn. Empty squares, usually bustling, echoed with the uneasy silence that followed such a confession. The church, a formidable stone structure at the heart of the village, was more than just a place of worship. It was a center of social life, a repository of records, and a powerful instrument of justice. Its sacred ground, the churchyard, served as both burial ground and often as the location for public punishments, reinforcing its dual role in mediating both spiritual and temporal law. Listen to the low murmur of whispered sins, barely audible, as a peasant knelt before the priest in the dim light of the confessional, unburdening their soul. Hear the solemn, measured tones of the priest, his voice grave, his questions probing, his pronouncements carrying the immense weight of divine judgment and earthly authority. See the peasant's bowed head, their hands clasped tightly, their body trembling with fear and the desperate hope of absolution. Confession is no refuge when the priest's word carries the weight of law. While the primary purpose of confession was spiritual, to absolve sins and prepare the soul for salvation, the priest, as a figure of immense authority in a profoundly illiterate society, often became an arbiter of secular morality as well. His knowledge of local affairs, his understanding of community grievances, and his power to assign penance extended beyond purely spiritual matters. A whisper in the confessional, intended for God's ears alone, could lead to a lifetime of penance, or a public lash. If a peasant confessed to a crime that had a secular dimension, petty theft, adultery, assault, or neglecting feudal duties, the priest, in his role as a guardian of communal order, might choose to impose a public penance. This could range from standing barefoot in front of the church during Mass to wearing a symbolic garment of shame to, more brutally, a public lashing. The fear of unconfessed sin was immense, threatening eternal damnation. But the added fear that a private confession could lead to public humiliation, or physical pain, or even exposure to the Lord's court, created a profound psychological burden. It transformed the sacred act of confession into a perilous negotiation, shaping the very nature of their moral choices. The churchyard, with its visible instruments of punishment like the pillory or whipping post, served as a constant reminder of the priest's dual authority. It was a space where spiritual transgression could swiftly become public shame, where God's judgment was often manifested through earthly pain. Confession is no refuge when the priest's word carries the weight of law. A whisper in the confessional can lead to a lifetime of penance, or a public lash. The law of the churchyard was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both the terrifying power of the church and their earthly masters, where humiliation was often the law, and every confession carried the weight of eternal fate. The pillory and the shamestone, as the dawn bell tolled for judgment and the stern voice of the priest or reeve pronounced sentence, the heart of the medieval village square transformed into a grim stage for public retribution. The pillory and the shamestone were not mere instruments of confinement. They were profound symbols of public shame and power. Bound by wood or weighed by stone, the guilty stood for hours as jeers and rotten fruit flew. Their punishment was not primarily pain, but exposure, a chilling, deliberate humiliation designed to brand them forever in the collective memory of the community, reinforcing the strict, unwritten laws of their land. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, sharp and brutal, thick with the subtle scent of ice, frozen mud, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sour tang of humiliation and fear. The sounds were no longer the simple toll of the bell. They included the low murmur of the gathered crowd, the sharp clang of wood, the desperate pleas of the accused, and then the terrifying silence of absolute vulnerability. Frost glimmering on iron shackles reflecting the pale morning light underscored the stark brutality of the scene. The pillory was a heavy wooden framework typically erected in the village square, with holes for the head and hands, designed to secure an offender in a standing or kneeling position. The shame stone, or schandstein in Germanic cultures, was a heavy stone collar or a large cumbersome stone worn around the neck, or a heavy object to which the offender was chained, forcing them into public display. These were the instruments of their disgrace. Listen to the low murmur of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle, unspoken sympathy. Hear the sharp clang of wood as the pillory was secured, the desperate pleas of the accused, their words often choked by the confined position, their dignity stripped away. See the figure, bound and helpless, their face exposed to the jeers and the elements, their eyes lowered in profound shame. Bound by wood or weighed by stone, the guilty stand for hours as jeers and rotten fruit fly. The purpose of these punishments was explicit: public humiliation. The offender was made a spectacle, an object lesson for the entire community. They would stand for hours exposed to the elements, the biting cold, the relentless sun, the driving rain, their suffering a visual deterrent. The crowd, often encouraged by the local authorities, would participate actively in this theatre of shame. Jeers, insults, and rotten fruit or mud would be hurled at the offender, further amplifying their public disgrace. This collective condemnation was a powerful tool of social control, demonstrating the community's rejection of the transgression and its reaffirmation of its own moral code. Their punishment is not pain, but exposure. While physical discomfort was inherent in the pillory or shamestone, the primary agony was psychological. To be stripped of one's dignity, to be made an object of ridicule and contempt, to be branded as a public sinner in the eyes of one's neighbors, this was a punishment designed to leave an indelible mark, more permanent than any physical scar. The fear of such public shame was pervasive, a constant, chilling undercurrent to every action. A peasant would strive to avoid any transgression that might lead to such a profound loss of honor and standing within their community. Bound by wood or weighed by stone, the guilty stand for hours as jeers and rotten fruit fly. The pillory and the shamestone were strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspects of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public judgment, where humiliation was the law and every exposure carried the weight of a lifetime of disgrace. The town crier's voice. In the medieval village, where literacy was rare and communication often fragmented, the town crier was a figure of paramount importance. He was the living newspaper, the herald of authority, the voice that carried official pronouncements to the populace. The town crier's voice was a profound daily reality. Each morning he would read the latest decrees, bans on colours, songs, gatherings. Laws changed like weather, and ignorance was no defence, creating a constant, pervasive tension where every new pronouncement could suddenly transform an innocent act into a grave transgression. Imagine the air, crisp and biting, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of a waking village. They included the low murmur of hushed conversations, the rhythmic clang of a handbell, and the booming, authoritative voice of the crier. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that preceded and followed his pronouncements. From the market square to the churchyard, from the bridge crossing the river to the Lord's Manor Gate, the town crier was a ubiquitous presence. Dressed in a distinctive livery, often bearing the Lord's emblem, he would walk through the village, stopping at key locations. With a ringing of his handbell, he would gather the populace, their faces grimly focused, their attention absolute. Listen to the rhythmic clang of the town crier's handbell, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the morning air, signaling an imminent announcement. Hear the booming, authoritative voice of the crier, his words clear and resonant, often delivered in a formal, almost theatrical cadence. See the villagers, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, gathered in solemn clusters, listening intently, knowing that each word could profoundly impact their lives. Each morning, the town crier reads the latest decrees, bans on colors, songs, gatherings. The decrees could be anything: new taxes imposed by the Lord, new dates for communal labor, updated regulations on market trade, or, more subtly, bans on certain items of clothing, sumptuary laws, prohibitions on specific songs or gatherings deemed seditious or immoral, or warnings against plague or famine. These were not mere suggestions, they were laws, swiftly enforceable. Laws change like weather, and ignorance is no defense. This was the chilling reality for medieval peasants. Without written access to the law, relying solely on oral pronouncements, they were vulnerable to constant, unpredictable changes. What was permissible yesterday could be a punishable offense today. And crucially, the plea of ignorance was never accepted. To break a proclaimed law, however unknowingly, meant to face the full weight of its retribution. The psychological impact was immense. The constant uncertainty, the knowledge that any aspect of their lives could suddenly be regulated, created a pervasive tension. Every action, every conversation, every social gathering was subtly scrutinized against the latest pronouncements, deepening their secret fears. The power of the crier's voice was profound. It was the voice of authority, connecting the distant lord or the king to the humblest peasant. It reinforced the rigid hierarchy, the absolute nature of the law, and the chilling truth that their lives were perpetually subject to external command. Each morning, the town crier reads the latest decrees, bans on colors, songs, gatherings. Laws change like weather, and ignorance is no defense. The town crier's voice was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public pronouncements, where humiliation was often the law, and every word carried the weight of absolute truth and potential peril. The sin of silence. In the tightly knit, often claustrophobic world of the medieval peasant village, where survival hinged on communal trust and the watchful eye of both God and the Lord, privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. Beyond the overt laws and public pronouncements, a more insidious, pervasive rule dictated their moral choices: the sin of silence. Failing to report your neighbor's sin was itself a sin. And so, every friendship became a quiet test of fear, transforming the very act of knowing into a perilous moral dilemma, perpetually binding them in a chilling web of suspicion and unspoken judgment. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the faint, unsettling tang of suspicion. The sounds were no longer the cheerful chatter of a waking village. They included the low murmur of hushed gossip, the soft rustle of woolen cloaks as neighbors averted their gaze, and the profound, almost oppressive quiet that fell over conversations. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence of unspoken accusations. The medieval village was an intensely interdependent community. Survival relied on cooperation, on shared labor, on adherence to communal norms. This close proximity, while fostering strong bonds, also meant that few actions remained truly private. Any transgression, any deviation from established moral, social, or religious codes was quickly noticed, quickly whispered about. Listen to the low murmur of hushed gossip traveling like wildfire through the village, discussing a neighbor's perceived sin, a pilfered chicken, a harsh word, a suspected act of infidelity, a failure to attend Mass. Hear the subtle intake of breath, the abrupt silence if a suspected sinner entered a gathering. See the nervous glances exchanged between villagers, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and deep-seated apprehension. Failing to report your neighbor's sin was itself a sin. This was the chilling reality enforced by both the church and local custom. The priest, in his sermons, would tirelessly preach the importance of moral uprightness, of confessing sins, and of ensuring that all members of the community adhered to God's law. To know of a serious sin committed by a neighbor and to remain silent was to become complicit, to risk one's own soul, to invite divine wrath upon the entire community. The Lord's Reeve or the village elders too relied on this informal surveillance. Minor disputes, petty crimes, and social transgressions were often brought to their attention through this network of communal observation. To intentionally conceal a crime, particularly one that affected the Lord's revenue or the village's order, could lead to severe punishment for the silent witness, and so every friendship became a quiet test of fear. The bonds of camaraderie, of mutual support, were perpetually strained by this implicit demand for vigilance. To be a true friend might mean to shield a neighbor, but to do so was to risk one's own soul, one's own safety, one's own standing in the community. The moral dilemma was profound, creating a pervasive tension beneath the surface of all social interactions. The psychological impact was immense. The constant pressure to observe, to judge, to potentially report, eroded trust, amplified suspicion, and fostered a profound sense of isolation, even within intimate relationships. Who could truly be trusted when silence itself could condemn you? Even silence could condemn you. Failing to report your neighbor's sin was itself a sin. And so, every friendship became a quiet test of fear. The sin of silence was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both the terrifying power of the church and their earthly masters, where whispered judgments were the norm, and every act of friendship carried the weight of a profound moral compromise. The weight of power and the price of defiance. The king's justice, beyond the immediate confines of the village and the intimate, often arbitrary judgments of local elders, lay a broader yet distant authority, the king's justice. In the sprawling, often fragmented tapestry of medieval Europe, the king's law stretched far but saw little. In distant villages, sheriffs and bailiffs, acting as the monarch's representatives, ruled by whim, their punishments carried out in muddy squares beneath banners of faded glory, transforming abstract royal authority into a brutal, unpredictable reality, and intensifying the peasant's secret fears of its arbitrary reach. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the metallic tang of cold iron and the acrid smell of injustice. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of hushed gossip. They included the rhythmic clang of a handbell, the booming voice of a sheriff, and the mournful cries of the condemned. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that followed official pronouncements. The king, enthroned in a distant capital, possessed theoretical supreme authority. His justice system, gradually evolving, aimed to provide a consistent framework of law across his realm. But for the vast majority of peasants living in remote, isolated villages, direct royal justice was a rare, almost mythical occurrence. Instead, they experienced the king's law through his local representatives. Listen to the rhythmic clang of the sheriff's handbell, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the morning air, signaling an imminent pronouncement. Hear the booming, authoritative voice of the sheriff, his words clear and resonant, often delivered with an air of absolute, unquestioned power. See the villagers, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, gathered in solemn clusters, watching the arrival of royal authority. In distant villages, sheriffs ruled by whim. The sheriff, or shire reeve, was the king's chief officer in a shire, responsible for maintaining law and order, collecting taxes and administering justice. But far from the king's direct oversight, their power was often vast and arbitrary. Their interpretations of royal law, their severity of punishment, and their personal biases could profoundly shape the lives of the peasants under their jurisdiction. Their punishments were carried out in muddy squares beneath banners of faded glory. The village square, typically a bustling hub of commerce, was transformed into a grim stage for royal justice. Punishments, fines, public whippings, the pillory, or even the gallows, would be meted out with public ceremony, often beneath the faded banner of the king, a visible reminder that even in this remote corner, they were subject to royal authority. The psychological impact was immense. The unpredictable nature of the sheriff's justice, the knowledge that their fate could depend on his personal disposition, created a pervasive tension. The king's law, theoretically a source of order, often felt like an arbitrary, distant, and potentially brutal force, capable of crushing their lives without recourse. The absence of direct royal presence, the reliance on local, often corrupt officials, meant that justice was frequently skewed. The powerful could often manipulate the system, while the poor peasant, lacking influence or legal knowledge, was profoundly vulnerable. The king's law stretched far but saw little. In distant villages, sheriffs ruled by whim, their punishments carried out in muddy squares beneath banners of faded glory. The king's justice was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying arbitrary power of a distant, unseen monarch, where humiliation was often the law, and every decree carried the weight of absolute truth and potential peril. The punishment of pride. In the rigidly hierarchical world of medieval society, where every aspect of life, from labor to lineage, was strictly ordered, dress was far more than personal adornment. It was a visible declaration of one's station, meticulously governed by strict, often unwritten, rules. The punishment of pride was a chilling reality. A woman who dressed too finely could be stripped of her garments in public. A merchant who overcharged might wear his coins sewn into his clothes as shame, transforming transgression into a brutal spectacle of public humiliation, reinforcing the strict social boundaries and instilling a pervasive fear of stepping out of line. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sharp tang of humiliation and the acrid smell of injustice. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of hushed gossip. They included the jeers of the gathered crowd, the rustle of silk being ripped, and the authoritative voice of the Lord's reeve. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that followed such a public pronouncement. Sumptuary laws, though more formal in some regions and times, were always present as social conventions, dictating what clothing, fabrics, and adornments were permissible for each social class. Peasants were expected to wear coarse wool and linen in muted, earthy tones, avoiding bright colours, expensive silks, or elaborate jewellery, which were reserved for the nobility and wealthy merchants. Listen to the jeers of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle resentment, as a woman stood exposed, stripped of her pride. Hear the sharp crack of an overseer's staff, maintaining order, ensuring the humiliation was witnessed by all. See the woman, her face flushed with profound shame, her eyes lowered, her fine garments, symbols of her transgression, now torn and worthless. A woman who dressed too finely could be stripped of her garments in public. This was a particularly brutal and public form of humiliation designed to strip the offender not only of their illicit finery, but of their personal dignity. It was an act of public shaming meant to serve as a stark warning to all who dared to challenge the visible markers of social hierarchy. The sight of a woman exposed and shamed was a visceral lesson in the dangers of pride. A merchant who overcharged might wear his coins sewn into his clothes as shame. For a merchant whose reputation for honesty was crucial, the punishment for usury or fraudulent pricing could involve a public display of his transgression. The very coins he had illicitly gained would be sewn onto his clothing, or even around his neck, forcing him to parade through the market, his shame visible to all, his reputation irrevocably tarnished. The reasons for these punishments were deeply rooted in the medieval social order. Pride, particularly pride in dress, superbia, was considered a grave sin by the Church, blurring the lines between social class and spiritual transgression. Such laws sought to prevent social mobility, to maintain the visible distinctions between classes, and to punish any challenge to the divinely ordained hierarchy. The psychological impact was immense. The fear of such public humiliation, of being stripped of one's dignity, of being branded as a sinner or a social climber, was a pervasive, chilling undercurrent to every action. It forced individuals to conform rigidly to the unspoken rules, to suppress any outward display of ambition or individual flair that might be deemed excessive. A woman who dressed too finely could be stripped of her garments in public. A merchant who overcharged might wear his coins sewn into his clothes as shame. The punishment of pride was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public judgment, where humiliation was the law and pride carried a brutal price. The trial by water. In the shadowy, often brutal world of medieval justice, where evidence was scarce and the concept of an impartial trial often elusive, a desperate recourse was sometimes employed to determine guilt or innocence. The ordeal. Among these terrifying tests, the trial by water was one of the most chilling, steeped in both superstition and profound, grim faith. To prove innocence, the accused is bound and cast into the river. Float, and you're guilty. Sink, and you die, but with a clean soul, transforming a desperate accusation into a terrifying gamble with fate, where the very element of life became an instrument of agonizing judgment. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, thick with the subtle scent of cold river water, damp earth, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension mingled with the acrid tang of fear and profound uncertainty. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of hushed gossip. They included the solemn chanting of priests, the desperate cries of the accused, and the hushed gasps of the watching crowd. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that preceded such a terrifying ordeal. The trial by water, or ordeal by cold water, was a practice rooted in ancient Germanic and later Christian beliefs, particularly prevalent for accusations of witchcraft or serious crimes where conventional evidence was lacking. It was believed that pure water, as an element blessed by God, would reject those who were guilty, i.e., witches or unrepentant sinners, causing them to float, while the innocent, being accepted by God, would sink. Listen to the solemn chanting of the priest, his voice echoing through the cold morning air, invoking God's judgment, blessing the water, making the ritual sacred. Hear the desperate cries of the accused, their pleas for mercy, their denials, their terror palpable. See the accused, their hands and feet bound with heavy ropes, their eyes wide with profound, paralyzing fear, being carried to the edge of the deep, cold river. To prove innocence, the accused is bound and cast into the river. The process was simple, brutal, and terrifying. The accused, often stripped of their outer garments, would be tied with ropes, perhaps with a heavy stone attached to ensure they could sink. They would then be cast into the frigid, fast-flowing river, their body plunging into the icy depths, the cold biting with agonizing intensity. Float, and you're guilty. Sink, and you die, but with a clean soul. If the accused floated, if their body resisted the water's embrace, it was taken as a clear sign of guilt, a divine judgment that the water had rejected their impure form. If they sank, if their body was accepted by the water, it was seen as proof of innocence. The terrible irony was that true innocence often meant death by drowning, while survival often meant a conviction for witchcraft or crime, leading to execution. The psychological impact was immense. The fear of the ordeal of the cold water, of the terrifying judgment, was overwhelming. It forced many accused to confess, however falsely, to avoid the ordeal, or to attempt desperate acts of self-preservation. The crowd, watching in hushed, terrified silence, believed implicitly in the divine nature of the judgment. Their gasps, their murmurs, their reactions were part of the brutal theatre of medieval justice. Float and you're guilty, sink and you die, but with a clean soul. The trial by water was a strange, pervasive and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying, arbitrary power of divine judgment, where humiliation and death were often the law, and innocence itself carried a brutal price. The branding iron. In the harsh, often merciless world of medieval justice, where punishment aimed not just to inflict pain, but to mark and dehumanize, certain transgressions left an indelible imprint. The branding iron was a terrifying, pervasive reality. The smell of iron, the hiss of flesh. A thief carried the mark forever, a silent badge of disgrace more permanent than any prison, transforming a moment of transgression into a lifelong stigma, and serving as a chilling public reminder of the swift, brutal consequences of defying the Lord's law. Imagine the air, thick with the acrid stench of burning flesh, mingled with the metallic tang of hot iron, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension and profound fear. The sounds were no longer the distant toll of a judgment bell. They included the low moans of the condemned, the sharp hiss of searing flesh, and the hushed gasps of the watching crowd. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that preceded such a brutal public ritual. Branding, the practice of permanently marking an offender's skin with a hot iron, was a common form of medieval punishment for various crimes, particularly theft, vagrancy, or repeat offences. It was a punishment designed to be visible, unmistakable, and utterly indelible, branding the individual as a criminal for life. Listen to the low moans of the condemned, their body rigid with terror, their cries often muffled by a gag. Hear the sharp hiss of searing flesh as the glowing hot iron, typically shaped into a letter like T for thief or a cross for sacrilege, was pressed onto their skin. See the plume of acrid smoke, the sickening sizzle of flesh, and the red, raw, bubbling wound that would forever mark the individual. The smell of iron, the hiss of flesh. The process was excruciatingly painful, an agony that seared not just the skin but the very soul. The raw stench of burning flesh, mingling with the metallic tang of hot iron, was an olfactory assault designed to make the experience unforgettable for both the victim and the witnesses. A thief carries the mark forever, a silent badge of disgrace more permanent than any prison. Unlike imprisonment, which could be temporary, or whipping, whose scars might eventually fade, a brand was a permanent, visible stigma. It served as a constant reminder of their crime, making it impossible to escape their past, to find new employment, or to fully reintegrate into society. They were marked literally for life. The psychological impact was immense. To be branded was to be publicly shamed, to be dehumanized, to have one's identity irrevocably altered by a single act of transgression. It was a profound loss of honor, making the branded individual an object of suspicion, fear, and contempt wherever they went. The branding ritual was almost always public, performed in the village square, witnessed by the entire community. This was the brutal theatre of medieval justice, designed not just to punish one, but to remind all who watched of the swift, brutal consequences of defying the Lord's law and the indelible nature of crime. The brand was more permanent than any prison. It condemned a man to a life on the fringes, forever carrying the visible burden of his past, forever reminded of his moment of defiance and its brutal price. The smell of iron, the hiss of flesh. A thief carries the mark forever, a silent badge of disgrace more permanent than any prison. The branding iron was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public shame, where humiliation was the law, and every transgression carried a visible, indelible price. The forbidden words. In the profoundly religious and rigidly hierarchical world of medieval society, where the church's authority permeated every aspect of life and the Lord's power was absolute, words were far more than mere sounds. They were dangerous tools capable of shaping thought, inciting rebellion, or incurring divine wrath. The forbidden words were a chilling reality. Blasphemy, gossip, laughter during Mass all could mean the lash. In the Middle Ages, words themselves were dangerous tools of rebellion, shaping a pervasive, insidious fear that dictated every utterance and instilled a constant, terrifying self-censorship. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of old stone, beeswax candles, and the lingering aroma of incense, mingled with the faint tang of fear and unspoken thoughts. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of a village. They included the low murmur of hushed conversations, the solemn chanting of priests, and the sudden, terrifying crack of a whip. Empty squares, usually bustling, now echoed with the uneasy silence that followed official pronouncements. The Church, in its immense spiritual authority, and the feudal lord, in his absolute temporal power, both enforced strict controls over speech. Certain words, certain topics, certain tones were simply forbidden, deemed dangerous to the social, moral, or spiritual order. Ignorance was no defense. The consequences for transgression were severe. Listen to the low murmur of hushed conversations in the marketplace, their voices carefully modulated, avoiding any contentious topics, any words that might be overheard and misinterpreted. Hear the solemn chanting of the priest during Mass, his words commanding absolute reverence, allowing no interruption, no inappropriate sound. See the faces of villagers, their expressions guarded, their eyes cautious, as they navigated a world where every utterance carried potential peril. Blasphemy, gossip, laughter during Mass all could mean the lash. Blasphemy, any disrespect or irreverence towards God, Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints was considered a grave sin, a direct challenge to divine authority. Such words could invite divine wrath upon the entire community. Gossip, particularly if it involved accusations against neighbors or criticism of local authority, could lead to public shaming, fines, or even more severe punishment for inciting discord. Laughter during Mass or any inappropriate noise in church was a profound act of disrespect to God and to the sacred ritual, a transgression that could invite the lash or public penance. In the Middle Ages, words themselves were dangerous tools of rebellion. Even a casual remark, a poorly chosen phrase, a joke that was misinterpreted, could be seen as sedition, heresy, or a challenge to authority. The power of words to shape opinion, to incite discontent, was well understood by those in power, and thus strict controls were implemented. The psychological impact was immense. The constant self-censorship, the fear of uttering a forbidden word, created a pervasive tension. Every conversation was subtly scrutinized, every thought carefully suppressed. The mind, even in its most private moments, learned to police its own language, deepening the secret fears that permeated their lives. The penalties for uttering forbidden words could be severe: fines, public penance, the pillory, the lash, or for repeated or severe transgressions like heresy, even execution. The fear of such retribution was a powerful motivator, enforcing absolute conformity. Blasphemy, gossip, laughter during Mass all could mean the lash. In the Middle Ages, words themselves were dangerous tools of rebellion. The forbidden words were a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both the terrifying power of the Church and their earthly masters, where whispered judgments were the norm, and every utterance carried the weight of profound peril and potential punishment, the square as stage. In the medieval village, where formal justice was often distant and legal processes opaque, the enforcement of law relied heavily on public spectacle. The square as stage was a chilling, pervasive reality. Justice was performance, a stage built on fear. Each sentence was meant not just to punish one, but to remind all who watched, transforming individual transgression into a communal lesson, a brutal display of authority that dictated obedience and instilled a constant, pervasive fear of defying the strict, unwritten laws of their land. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, sharp and brutal, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sour tang of humiliation and fear. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of a town. They included the low murmur of the gathered crowd, the sharp clang of wood or iron, the desperate cries of the accused, and then the terrifying silence of absolute vulnerability. Frost glimmering on iron shackles, reflecting the pale morning light, underscored the stark brutality of the scene. The village or town square, typically a bustling hub of commerce and social interaction, was transformed into the primary venue for judicial proceedings and public punishment. Its open, central location ensured maximum visibility, allowing the entire community to witness the full weight of the law. Listen to the low murmur of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle, unspoken sympathy. Hear the authoritative voice of the Lord's Reeve, or the village elder pronouncing sentence, their words cutting through the silence with chilling finality. See the makeshift gallows, the whipping post, or the pillory, already erected in the centre of the square, stark and ominous against the morning sky. Justice was performance, a stage built on fear. Every element of the punishment was designed for maximum theatrical effect. The condemned, often stripped of their outer garments, their head bowed, would be paraded through the streets, or placed in the pillory, or bound to the whipping post. Their humiliation was public, deliberate, and designed to strip them of dignity, to make them an object lesson for all. Each sentence was meant not just to punish one, but to remind all who watched. The purpose was explicit: deterrence. The sight of a neighbor, a friend, or even a relative subjected to public shame and physical pain served as a visceral warning to every single member of the community. It reinforced the strictness of the law, the absolute power of the authorities, and the dire consequences of transgression. The crowd, often compelled to attend, played a crucial role in this theatre of punishment. Their jeers, their thrown rotten fruit or mud, their visible condemnation amplified the shame of the offender, transforming individual guilt into collective judgment. This communal participation solidified the moral boundaries of the village, reaffirming its values and its adherence to established order. The psychological impact was immense. To witness such a brutal spectacle, to see a fellow human being stripped of their dignity, was a crushing burden. It instilled a profound, pervasive fear of transgression, a constant awareness of the strict, unforgiving laws that governed their lives, shaping their moral choices and their deepest, secret fears. The square as stage was a pervasive, fundamental ritual in the Middle Ages, transforming justice into a chilling spectacle of public shame and power. It was a calm, haunting descent into a world where humiliation was the law, and every sentence, every lash, every tear echoed through the uneasy silence, a constant reminder of the brutal rules that bound them, forever etched into the collective memory of the community. The theatre of punishment, the whipping post. In the chilling theatre of medieval justice, where the village square served as a stark stage for public retribution, the whipping post was one of the most common and brutal instruments of punishment. It was a visceral declaration of authority, meant not just to inflict pain, but to shame and deter. The whipping post was a harrowing reality. Crowds gather, the whip cracks, mothers turn away. Children learn early what obedience looks like, transforming individual transgression into a profound communal lesson etched into the very fabric of medieval society. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, sharp and brutal, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the acrid tang of fear and profound pain. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of the gathered crowd. They included the sharp crack of the whip, the desperate cries of the condemned, and the uneasy silence that followed each blow. Frost glimmering on iron shackles, reflecting the pale morning light, underscored the stark brutality of the scene. The whipping post, a sturdy wooden pillar or cross, often erected permanently in the village square, was a ubiquitous symbol of medieval justice. It was a place of public spectacle where offenders, petty thieves, vagrants, adulterers, those who had committed minor assaults or defied local ordinances, were brought to receive their corporal punishment. Listen to the low murmur of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle, unspoken sympathy. Hear the sharp, authoritative voice of the Lord's reeve or the executioner reading the sentence, his words cutting through the silence with chilling finality. See the condemned, often stripped to the waist, their body rigid with terror, their hands bound securely to the post, their back bared to the cold air. Crowds gather, the whip cracks. Attendance was often not voluntary. It was a communal obligation, a ritual designed to maximize the impact of the punishment. The executioner, often the village hangman or a local official, would wield a heavy leather whip, its thongs capable of inflicting immense pain. The sharp crack of the whip, cutting through the cold air, was a sound of profound brutality, signaling the immediate, agonizing onset of punishment. Mothers turn away. Children learn early what obedience looks like. The sight was horrific, sickening. Mothers, their faces etched with anguish, would often turn away, shielding their younger children's eyes, trying to protect them from the visceral display of pain. But the older children, standing wide-eyed in the crowd, absorbed the brutal lesson. They saw the consequences of disobedience, the price of defiance, the stark reality of the law's unforgiving power. They learned, implicitly, that conformity, submission, and absolute obedience were paramount for survival. The psychological impact was immense. To witness such a public display of pain and humiliation, to see a neighbor, a friend, or even a relative subjected to brutal physical retribution was a crushing burden. It instilled a profound, pervasive fear of transgression, a constant awareness of the strict, unforgiving laws that governed their lives. The cold, sharp air would amplify the sting of the whip, making the wounds even more agonizing. The public nature of the punishment added a layer of profound shame, branding the offender in the collective memory of the community. Crowds gather, the whip cracks, mothers turn away. Children learn early what obedience looks like. The whipping post was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public punishment, where humiliation and pain were the law, and every crack of the whip carried the weight of absolute obedience. The Scarlet Hood. In the medieval village, where social order was rigidly enforced and moral transgressions deeply condemned, punishment was not always about physical pain. Sometimes it was about a far more insidious, enduring torment, public shame. The Scarlet Hood was a chilling, pervasive reality. In some towns, adulterers wore coloured hoods for a year, a slow parade of humiliation through every street they once called home, transforming a private sin into a public, inescapable spectacle of disgrace, constantly reminding them and the community of their transgression. Imagine the air, crisp and biting, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sour tang of humiliation and profound fear. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of a town. They included the low murmur of whispered gossip, the uneasy silence of averted gazes, and the distant, mournful toll of a church bell. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated figures whose faces were obscured, yet whose shame was painfully visible. Adultery, a transgression against both religious and social law, was considered a grave sin in medieval society, particularly disruptive to the familial and communal order. While punishments varied, a common form for a married woman and sometimes a man was public shaming, designed to brand them as morally deficient and warn others against similar transgressions. Listen to the low murmur of whispered gossip, travelling like wildfire through the town as the figure approached. Hear the uneasy silence that fell over conversations, the rustle of woolen cloaks as people averted their gazes, acknowledging the shame without direct confrontation. See the condemned, their face often covered by the hood, their body rigid with profound humiliation, moving slowly through the familiar streets. In some towns, adulterers wore coloured hoods for a year, a slow parade of humiliation through every street they once called home. The scarlet hood, often a cone-shaped hat, or a cloak with a prominent, brightly coloured hood, typically red, a colour associated with sin and passion, was an unmistakable symbol of their transgression. It had to be worn constantly for an entire year, making it impossible for the individual to hide their shame. This was a profoundly insidious punishment. It was not pain, but a relentless, inescapable psychological torment. To walk through the familiar streets of one's own town, to enter the marketplace, to attend church, to perform daily duties, always wearing the visible mark of one's sin, always subjected to the knowing glances, the hushed whispers, the averted gazes. This was a living death of social disgrace. The shame was immense, not just for the individual, but for their entire family, who also bore the social stigma. It served as a constant reminder of their transgression, transforming their private sin into a public, inescapable spectacle, ensuring that the lesson of their defiance was absorbed by every member of the community. The psychological impact was devastating. It eroded personal dignity, fostered a profound sense of isolation, and often left the individual permanently marginalized within their community. The scarlet hood was a chain of shame, heavier and more enduring than any made of iron. In some towns, adulterers wore coloured hoods for a year, a slow parade of humiliation through every street they once called home. The scarlet hood was a strange, pervasive and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public shame, where humiliation was the law, and sin carried a visible, indelible price that followed them wherever they walked. The parade of sin. In the medieval village, where public shame was a cornerstone of justice and every transgression threatened the fragile social order, punishment was often transformed into a grim, didactic performance. The parade of sin was a pervasive, chilling ritual. Criminals were made to walk barefoot through town, carrying symbols of their crime: a loaf for a thief, a mirror for vanity, a broom for gossip, transforming individual transgression into a communal spectacle, designed not just to punish one, but to remind all of the moral boundaries and the enduring power of public judgment. Imagine the air, utterly frigid, sharp and brutal, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sour tang of humiliation and profound fear. The sounds were no longer the simple chatter of a town. They included the low murmur of the gathered crowd, the rhythmic shuffle of bare feet, and the authoritative voice of the town crier. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated figures whose shame was painfully visible. This form of public penance and shaming was common across medieval Europe, particularly for lesser crimes or moral transgressions where physical mutilation or execution was deemed too harsh. It was a ritual designed to inflict psychological pain, to strip the offender of their dignity, and to brand them indelibly in the collective memory of the community. Listen to the low murmur of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle, unspoken sympathy. Hear the rhythmic shuffle of bare feet on the cold, muddy cobblestones, a sound of profound vulnerability and public disgrace. See the condemned, their heads often shaved or cropped short, their expressions etched with profound shame, paraded slowly through the narrow streets of their own town. Criminals were made to walk barefoot through town, carrying symbols of their crime. Each offender would carry a visual emblem of their transgression, a tangible representation of their sin. A thief might be forced to carry a large, mouldy loaf of bread or a heavy sack of grain, symbolizing his theft. A woman accused of vanity or immodesty might carry a broken mirror. A notorious gossiper might be forced to carry a broom or even a fish, symbolizing the stench of their words. These symbols were immediately recognizable to the populace, amplifying the shame. The town crier, often walking ahead of the condemned, would loudly proclaim their crime, ensuring that every villager understood the nature of their transgression. The route of the parade would often take the offender past their own home, their workplace, the market square, and the church, places that were once familiar and safe, now transformed into a stage for their humiliation. The psychological impact was immense. To be stripped of one's dignity, to be made an object of ridicule and contempt, to have one's sin publicly displayed and condemned in the eyes of one's neighbors. This was a punishment designed to leave an indelible mark, more permanent than any physical scar. The cold of the winter air, the mud on their bare feet, the jeers and sometimes thrown refuse from the crowd. These physical discomforts amplified the psychological agony. It was a brutal lesson in social conformity, a powerful deterrent against future transgressions. Criminals were made to walk barefoot through town, carrying symbols of their crime: a loaf for a thief, a mirror for vanity, a broom for gossip. The parade of sin was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters, and the terrifying power of public shame, where humiliation was the law. And every sin carried a visible, indelible price that followed them through every street they once called home. The market of punishment. In the bustling, sensory-rich chaos of the medieval market, where the clamour of trade and the aroma of commerce filled the air, the harsh realities of justice often made a chilling intrusion. The market of punishment was a pervasive, brutal reality. On market days, justice and trade met side by side. The smell of bread mingled with that of sweat and fear. Even the guilty became part of the economy of spectacle, their public shame a grim commodity, reinforcing the strict laws of the land and providing a stark, visceral reminder of the constant scrutiny under which all lives were lived. Imagine the air, thick with the earthy scent of bread, salted fish, and fresh produce, mingled with the pervasive aroma of wood smoke, human sweat, and the subtle tang of fear and profound shame. The sounds were no longer just the cheerful shouts of vendors. They included the low murmur of haggling, the rhythmic clang of scales, the jeers of the crowd, and the sharp crack of a whip. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated a scene where daily commerce played out against a backdrop of public suffering. Market days were the most important social and economic events in the medieval town. Villagers from the surrounding countryside would flock to the square, bringing their produce, their crafts, their livestock. The market was a vibrant hub of exchange, gossip, and communal interaction. It was precisely this high visibility that made it a prime location for the theatre of punishment. Listen to the cacophony of the market, the shouting of vendors, the lowing of cattle, the squealing of pigs, the chatter of hundreds of voices. Hear the sudden sharp clang of a bell, signalling the arrival of the Lord's Reeve or the town officials demanding attention. See the pillory, the stocks, or the whipping post, stark and ominous against the backdrop of bustling commerce. On market days, Justice and trade met side by side, the smell of bread mingled with that of sweat and fear. The condemned, whether bound in the pillory, shackled in the stocks, or subjected to public whipping, would be put on display directly adjacent to the stalls selling bread, cheese, and ale. The rich, comforting aroma of baked bread, a symbol of sustenance, would mingle cruelly with the acrid smell of human sweat, fear, and sometimes blood. The purpose was explicit: deterrence and reinforcement. By placing the punishment within the most vibrant public space during the busiest time, the authorities ensured that every single member of the community, rich and poor, native and visitor, witnessed the consequences of transgression. The vivid, visceral display served as a constant, brutal reminder of the omnipresent law and the harsh penalties for defiance. Even the guilty became part of the economy of spectacle. The crowds, often encouraged to participate, would hurl not just insults but rotten fruit, mud, or even stones at the condemned. This collective condemnation amplified the shame, turning the offender into a temporary commodity, a grim part of the market's entertainment, a living embodiment of the consequences of sin. The psychological impact was immense. To witness such a public display of pain and humiliation, to see a fellow human being stripped of their dignity amidst the mundane activities of buying and selling, was a crushing burden. It instilled a profound, pervasive fear of transgression, a constant awareness of the strict, unforgiving laws that governed their lives. On market days, justice and trade met side by side. The smell of bread mingled with that of sweat and fear. The market of punishment was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public judgment, where humiliation was the law and every transgression was a brutal public lesson. The law in the shadows, the secret courts. In the medieval world, where public spectacle often served as a brutal theatre of justice, not all pronouncements of law unfolded under the harsh glare of the sun or the jeers of a crowd. Beyond the visible punishments lay a more insidious, terrifying realm, the secret courts. Not all trials were public. In dim stone rooms, whispered accusations, often fueled by rumor or personal vendetta, quickly became verdicts, and no one saw the condemned again, transforming legal process into an instrument of profound terror, an unseen hand that could snatch lives from the community without explanation or trace. Imagine the air inside a small, cold stone room, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, old parchment, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, mingled with the acrid tang of fear and injustice. The sounds were no longer the vibrant clamor of the marketplace. They included the low murmur of whispered accusations, the solemn voice of a judge, the rhythmic scrape of a quill, and the chilling silence that followed a guilty verdict. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated grim faces, heading to a place from which there was no return. These secret courts, often held within the Lord's manor, in the dark confines of a castle dungeon, or in secluded chambers of the church, were a stark contrast to the public tribunals of the village square. They dealt with more sensitive matters, accusations of heresy, treason, witchcraft, or serious crimes that might involve powerful individuals or destabilize the community if tried openly. Listen to the low murmur of whispered accusations, barely audible, their words carrying immense weight and potential for ruin. Hear the solemn, measured tones of the judge, often the Lord himself, or his trusted steward, his questions probing, his gaze unwavering, his pronouncements carrying absolute finality. see the accused often alone, without counsel, their faces etched with profound fear and bewilderment, confronting an unseen, implacable power. Whispered accusations became verdicts. Evidence in these courts was often circumstantial, based on rumor, confessions extracted under duress, or the testimony of anonymous accusers. The accused had little opportunity to defend themselves, no right to confront their accusers. The process was swift, opaque, and utterly devoid of the public oversight that, however brutal, offered some semblance of accountability. And no one saw the condemned again. The punishments meted out by secret courts were often severe: long imprisonment in dark dungeons, torture, banishment to distant lands, or, most terrifyingly, execution. But, unlike public executions, which served as a clear warning, those condemned by secret courts simply vanished. Their absence became a chilling rumor, their fate a terrifying mystery. The psychological impact was immense. Perhaps fueled by a neighbor's envy or a lord's whim, could lead to a secret trial and permanent disappearance, created a pervasive tension. It eroded trust, fostered profound suspicion, and instilled a deep-seated paranoia, transforming personal disputes into potentially lethal threats. The power of these courts was absolute, their reach insidious, their methods shrouded in secrecy. They served as a potent tool for maintaining the Lord's authority, for suppressing dissent, and for eliminating those deemed a threat to the established order, all beyond the scrutiny of the common populace. Not all trials were public. In dim stone rooms, whispered accusations became verdicts, and no one saw the condemned again. The secret courts were a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying, unseen power of absolute, secretive judgment, where humiliation was the law and disappearance was often the ultimate price of defiance. The law of the Lord's manor. In the medieval world, where the very concept of land ownership dictated almost every aspect of existence, the peasant's life was irrevocably bound to the will of their feudal master. The law of the Lord's manor was an omnipresent, unyielding force. A peasant could be fined for cutting a tree, picking herbs, or fishing in the Lord's stream. Every act of survival was a trespass, transforming basic necessities into potential crimes, intensifying the constant, pervasive fear of transgression, and keeping the peasant in a perpetual state of subservience to their powerful overlord. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sharp tang of unspoken ownership. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of whispered accusations. They included the rhythmic clang of distant axes, the rustle of leaves, and the authoritative voice of the Lord's reeve, his words carrying the weight of unquestioned power. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated grim faces, acutely aware of the boundaries of their existence. The Lord, as the owner of the manor, held ultimate dominion over all the land, its resources, and all who lived upon it. While peasants were granted strips of land for cultivation and might have customary rights, these were always subordinate to the Lord's superior ownership. Every tree, every stream, every wild animal was ultimately his property. Listen to the rhythmic clang of a distant axe, cutting wood in the Lord's forest, a sound of essential labor, yet one fraught with peril. Hear the hushed whispers of neighbors, recounting a tale of a peasant caught poaching or gathering fallen timber without permission, their voices low with fear. See the dense forest bordering the village, a vital resource yet also a forbidden zone, its depths hiding potential punishments. A peasant could be fined for cutting a tree, picking herbs, or fishing in the Lord's stream. These were not minor transgressions. Cutting down a tree, even a fallen one, without the Lord's explicit permission was theft of his timber, punishable by heavy fines or corporal punishment. Picking herbs, vital for medicine or seasoning, might be restricted to certain areas or require a fee. Fishing in the Lord's stream, poaching deer or rabbits from his woods, these were grave offences, direct challenges to his ownership and his authority. For the peasant, whose life depended on foraging, on utilising the natural resources of the land, this was a cruel, omnipresent bind. To gather fuel for the fire, to find medicinal plants, to supplement a meagre diet with wild game, these basic acts of self-preservation were perpetually shadowed by the threat of breaking the Lord's law. The Lord's reeve or bailiff, his local representative, vigorously enforced these rules. Patrols would monitor the forests, guards would watch the streams, and informers might report any suspected transgression. The penalties were severe, heavy fines that could plunge a family into debt, confiscation of precious tools, public whippings, or even imprisonment in the Lord's dungeon. The psychological impact was immense. The constant fear of transgression, the knowledge that any act of survival could be construed as a crime, created a pervasive tension. It eroded their sense of autonomy, reinforcing their utter subservience to their feudal master. A peasant could be fined for cutting a tree, picking herbs, or fishing in the Lord's stream. Every act of survival was a trespass. The law of the Lord's manor was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws enforced by their earthly masters and the terrifying power of feudal ownership, where even the humblest act of gathering could carry a brutal price. Every act of survival was a trespass, the confession under torchlight. In the shadowed, often brutal world of medieval justice, where guilt and innocence could be fluid concepts and the truth often elusive, torture was sometimes employed not just as punishment, but as a tool to extract a desired confession. The confession under torchlight was a terrifying, pervasive reality. Truth was not always spoken. Sometimes it was forced. The flicker of flame, the scrape of chains, the priest's cold demand for honesty transformed a private interrogation into a chilling psychological and physical ordeal, forever blurring the lines between justice, coercion, and profound terror. Imagine the air inside a small, cold stone room, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, old parchment, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the acrid tang of fear, sweat, and burning tallow. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of whispered accusations. They included the rhythmic drip of water, the soft scrape of chains, the low moans of the accused, and the solemn, unwavering voice of the interrogator. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated grim faces, heading to a place from which few returned whole. Interrogations, particularly in the Lord's dungeon or a secluded chamber of the church, were often conducted in semi-darkness, designed to heighten the psychological pressure on the accused. A few flickering torches or candles provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows that distorted familiar shapes, amplifying the sense of isolation and profound vulnerability. Listen to the rhythmic drip of water, its sound amplified by the stone walls, marking the agonizing passage of time. Hear the soft scrape of chains against rough stone as the accused, often shackled, shifted his weight, his body aching with discomfort and fear. See the flickering flame of a torch held aloft by a grim-faced guard, its light dancing on the gaunt, terrified face of the accused, illuminating his fear. Truth was not always spoken. Sometimes it was forced.
The interrogators, often the Lord's Reeve, a stern legal official, or even a priest in cases of heresy or witchcraft, were relentless. They sought not necessarily objective truth,
but a confession, which was considered the highest form of evidence. They would employ various forms of psychological pressure, prolonged confinement, sleep deprivation, intimidation, and the terrifying threat of torture. The flicker of flame, the scrape of chains, the priest's cold demand for honesty. The flickering torchlight itself was a tool of psychological manipulation, disorienting the accused, making them feel perpetually watched, blurring the lines between reality and illusion. The constant scrape of chains, the low moans of previous victims echoing from unseen cells, were subtle but powerful torments. The priest's presence in certain cases added a layer of spiritual coercion. He would demand honesty before God, reminding the accused of the eternal damnation that awaited those who lied or concealed their sins. His cold, unwavering demand for honesty, framed by the flickering torchlight, transformed the interrogation into a terrifying spiritual trial. The use of physical torture, though theoretically regulated by medieval law and often forbidden for the clergy to apply directly, was a terrifying reality. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrews, these instruments of agony were present, their mere existence a powerful threat, forcing many to confess to crimes they may or may not have committed, simply to end the torment. The psychological impact was immense. To be subjected to such an interrogation, to have truth forcefully extracted, to be pushed to the very limits of physical and mental endurance, left an indelible mark. It shattered the spirit, eroded trust, and instilled a profound, lifelong terror. Truth was not always spoken. Sometimes it was forced. The flicker of flame, the scrape of chains, the priest's cold demand for honesty. The confession under torchlight was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying, unseen power of secretive justice, where torture was a grim reality and honesty was often a forced, agonizing performance. The outlaw's mark, in the harsh, unforgiving world of medieval society, where communal bonds were paramount and legal protection hinged on one's place within the established order, to be cast out was a fate worse than death. The outlaw's mark was a chilling, pervasive reality. Once banished, an outlaw's name was scratched from church rolls. The living erased while still breathing, condemned to wander the forests alone, transforming legal punishment into a profound spiritual and social death, a terrifying permanent stigma that haunted their very existence. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the cold tang of social exclusion. The sounds were no longer the low murmur of whispered accusations. They included the mournful cry of the wind through desolate forests, the distant howl of wolves, and the chilling silence that fell over a village at the mention of a banished name. Moonlight over empty squares, usually bustling, now illuminated the stark reality of profound isolation. To be declared an outlaw was the most severe punishment short of execution. It meant losing all legal rights, all protection under the law. An outlaw could be killed by anyone without legal repercussion. He was literally outside the law. This draconian punishment was typically reserved for grave crimes: murder, treason, persistent theft, or defiance of the Lord's authority, where the offender was deemed too dangerous or too transgressive to remain within society. Listen to the low, mournful cry of the wind through desolate forests. a desolate sound that echoed the profound solitude of the outlaw. Hear the distant howl of wolves, their predatory calls a constant reminder of the physical dangers that lurked in the wilderness. See the grim faces of villagers, their expressions etched with fear as they discussed the fate of a banished man, knowing the brutal reality of his existence. Once banished, an outlaw's name was scratched from church rolls. This was a profound act of spiritual and social erasure. His name would be formally removed from the parish registers, from any record of births, marriages, or deaths. He was, in effect, dead to the community, dead to God, a living ghost. He could not receive sacraments, could not be buried in consecrated ground, could not participate in any aspect of communal life. The living erased while still breathing, condemned to wander the forests alone. The outlaw was forced to abandon his home, his family, his land, and his village, becoming a perpetual wanderer, surviving on what he could scavenge or steal. The vast, untamed forests, usually a source of fuel and forage, now became his only refuge, a dangerous wilderness teeming with wild animals and the constant threat of capture or summary execution. The psychological impact was immense. To be stripped of one's identity, of one's legal rights, of one's spiritual connection, was a profound, soul-crushing torment. The constant fear of discovery, the gnawing hunger, the relentless cold, the profound loneliness, these conspired to break the spirit, to dehumanize the individual. The outlaw's mark was not just a legal status, it was a permanent stigma, a visible badge of disgrace that made it impossible to ever fully reintegrate into society. Even if he survived, his life was irrevocably altered, forever defined by his banishment. Once banished, an outlaw's name was scratched from church rolls. The living erased while still breathing, condemned to wander the forests alone. The outlaw's mark was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of social and spiritual exclusion, where humiliation was the law, and being erased was often the ultimate price of defiance. The secret pardon. In the harsh, unforgiving realm of medieval justice, where guilt often led to public shame, brutal punishment, or permanent banishment, the prospect of escape from such a fate was a desperate, tantalizing dream. Yet, for all its rigidity, medieval law, like life itself, sometimes bent. The secret pardon was a rare, profound anomaly. Occasionally, mercy came, but never for free. A noble's favor, a priest's intervention, or a coin slipped beneath the table could change fate, transforming an inescapable condemnation into a fragile, conditional reprieve, a subtle, often corrupt interplay of power, influence, and hidden transactions. Imagine the air inside a small, cold stone room, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, old parchment, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the faint tang of hope and desperate negotiation. The sounds were no longer the low moans of the condemned. They included the hushed murmurs of a clandestine meeting, the soft clink of coins, and the rhythmic scratch of a quill on a new, secret document. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets illuminated a scene where fate hung in a delicate, precarious balance. For those condemned to public shame, branding, exile, or even death, the legal system offered few avenues for appeal. Once a sentence was passed, particularly by the Lord's Court or a powerful church official, it was typically final. But human nature, with its inherent desire for mercy and its susceptibility to influence, sometimes found a way. Listen to the hushed murmurs of a clandestine conversation, their voices barely audible, discussing a delicate negotiation. Here the soft clink of coins discreetly exchanged, a tangible symbol of a life's value in the shadowy economy of justice. See the accused, their face etched with profound fear, their eyes wide with desperate hope as they awaited the verdict of a hidden power. Occasionally, mercy came, but never for free. The granting of a secret pardon was a rare privilege, usually reserved for those with connections, influence, or wealth. It was not an act of universal compassion, but a specific, targeted intervention, often driven by a complex web of personal allegiances, political considerations, or financial transactions. A noble's favor, a priest's intervention, or a coin slipped beneath the table could change fate. A powerful noble, perhaps impressed by a knight's past service or bound by kinship, might intercede with the Lord, pleading for clemency. A sympathetic priest, privy to the secrets of the confessional, might advocate for a repentant sinner, stressing the spiritual benefits of mercy. Or, more crudely, a substantial bribe, a bag of silver coins, a valuable piece of land, might be discreetly slipped to a corrupt official, altering the course of justice. The pardon, when granted, was often secret, unwritten, or subtly manipulated within the legal records, to avoid open contradiction of a public sentence. It was a fragile reprieve, conditional on strict adherence to unspoken terms, perpetually shadowed by the memory of the original condemnation. The psychological impact was immense. For the condemned, it was a profound, life-altering moment, a sudden, miraculous escape from a grim fate. But it also bred a deep sense of obligation, a lifelong gratitude to their benefactor, binding them in new, invisible chains of loyalty and service. This practice, while undermining the overt rule of law, also demonstrated its inherent flexibility and the pervasive influence of personal power and wealth. Justice, in the shadows, was often a negotiable commodity. A noble's favor, a priest's intervention, or a coin slipped beneath the table could change fate. The secret pardon was a strange, pervasive, and often frightening aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of their feudal lords, where humiliation was the law and mercy was a rare, expensive, and often hidden commodity. The memory of law and the echo of fear. The wall of shame. In the medieval town, where justice was often a brutal public spectacle and communal memory was long, punishment aimed not just to inflict pain, but to etch transgression into the very fabric of the community's consciousness. The wall of shame was a chilling, pervasive legacy. In some towns, the names of the condemned were carved into stone, a list that outlasted their bones, transforming individual disgrace into a permanent, public reminder, a silent, unyielding monument to the harsh laws of the Middle Ages and the enduring power of collective judgment. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of old stone, damp earth, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the cold tang of public judgment. The sounds were no longer the vibrant clamour of the marketplace. They included the low murmur of hushed whispers, the rustle of woolen cloaks as passers-by read the grim inscriptions, and the profound, almost oppressive silence that fell over those contemplating the fate of the condemned. Frost, glimmering on iron shackles now long gone, only hinted at past suffering. These walls of shame, often found on a prominent public building, the town hall, a gatehouse, or even the church itself, were physical manifestations of medieval justice. They served as a permanent record of those who had transgressed, a chilling complement to the pillory or the whipping post, ensuring that the memory of their crime and their punishment endured for generations. Listen to the low murmur of villagers, their voices hushed as they paused before the wall, reading the names, recalling the crimes, reinforcing the communal memory of justice served. Hear the uneasy silence that sometimes fell over children, their eyes wide with curiosity and apprehension, as an elder explained the meaning of the ancient carvings. See the rough-hewn stone scarred by time and weather, yet still bearing the indelible marks of names and transgressions, a cold, unyielding testament. The names of the condemned were carved into stone, a list that outlasted their bones. Each name etched into the stone was a symbol of disgrace, a public declaration of their moral failing. It might list their crime, theft, adultery, blasphemy, rebellion, and the punishment received. This inscription was a permanent stigma, an indelible mark that transcended their brief mortal lives, ensuring that their dishonor was perpetually remembered, even by those who had never known them. This was a profound act of collective memory, enforcing social conformity through the threat of eternal shame. To have one S name carved onto the wall of shame was a fate almost as terrifying as death itself, for it condemned one's memory to perpetual disgrace, erasing any chance of posthumous honor or redemption within the community. The psychological impact was immense. The constant presence of the wall, its grim inscriptions, served as a pervasive visual reminder of the strict laws that governed their lives, of the dire consequences of transgression, and of the unforgiving nature of communal judgment. It instilled a profound, pervasive fear of stepping out of line, of bringing shame upon oneself and one's family. The wall was a stark, unyielding monument to the power of the law, the authority of the Lord and the Church, and the unwavering will of the community to enforce its moral code. It was a physical manifestation of the invisible chains that bound medieval peasants to their place. Gravestones, carvings, and murals, reminders of a silence so vast it changed Europe forever. The pain carved in stone was a strange, pervasive, and terrifying aspect of daily life for medieval peasants. It was an unspoken code, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped their moral choices, deepened their secret fears, and reminded them that their very existence was bound by strict laws, enforced by both earthly masters and the terrifying power of public shame, where humiliation was the law, and memory was a cruel, eternal judge. The children who watched. In the medieval village, where justice was often a brutal public spectacle, punishment was not merely a lesson for the offender, it was a profound, visceral education for the entire community, particularly its youngest members. The children who watched were a haunting, pervasive legacy. Those who saw the punishments grew up knowing that justice was public, cruel, and always watching. They would teach their children the same fear, creating a profound, unbroken chain of inherited anxiety, ensuring the strict laws of the Middle Ages and the terror of their enforcement resonated through generations. Imagine the air, thick with the subtle scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the pervasive aroma of human apprehension, now mingled with the sour tang of humiliation and profound fear. The sounds were no longer the cheerful chatter of children. They included the low murmur of the gathered crowd, the sharp crack of the whip, the desperate cries of the condemned, and the uneasy silence that followed. Medieval faces, young and old, caught between guilt and survival, watched grimly. From their earliest years, children in medieval villages were exposed to the harsh realities of justice. Public punishments, the pillory, the stocks, the whipping post, even the gallows, were often erected in the central square, impossible to avoid. Their attendance, whether voluntary or compelled, was a formative experience, deeply ingrained in their developing understanding of the world. Listen to the low murmur of the gathered crowd, their voices a blend of morbid curiosity, condemnation, and perhaps a subtle, unspoken sympathy. Hear the sharp crack of the whip, cutting through the cold air, a visceral sound that brought a gasp to young lips. See the condemned, their faces etched with profound shame, their bodies subjected to public pain, their dignity stripped away. Those who saw the punishments grew up knowing that justice was public, cruel, and always watching. They witnessed the agonizing reality that transgressions, however small, could lead to brutal retribution. They saw their neighbors, their friends, even their parents, subjected to public humiliation and physical pain. This was not abstract law, it was vividly, viscerally real. The cruelty was not accidental, it was deliberate. The public nature of the punishment, the physical pain, the profound shame, all were designed to instill terror, to create a powerful deterrent. Children learned, implicitly, that conformity, submission, and absolute obedience to the Lord, S-law, and the Church, S-dictates, were paramount for survival. They would teach their children the same fear. The lessons learned in these grim spectacles were passed down from generation to generation, not just through explicit instruction, but through the pervasive atmosphere of caution and apprehension. The vivid memories of public shaming, of physical pain, of the swift, unforgiving hand of justice shaped their parenting, their advice, their very worldview. The psychological impact was immense, the constant awareness of being watched, of the ever-present possibility of transgression and punishment created a profound sense of anxiety. It bred a culture of self-censorship, of conformity, of deep-seated obedience, where the fear of justice became an internalized, constant companion. The children who watched were a pervasive, fundamental reality in medieval society, transforming the brutal spectacle of punishment into an enduring legacy of fear. It was a calm, haunting descent into a world where humiliation was the law, and every public lash, every jeer, every trembling tear echoed through the uneasy silence, a constant reminder of the brutal rules that bound them, forever etched into the collective memory of the community, shaping generations with the chilling truth that justice, however cruel, was always watching. The shadows in modern law. The medieval age, with its strange laws of public shame and brutal power, might seem a distant, barbaric past, utterly removed from the refinements of modern justice. Yet, the echo of that era persists. The shadows in modern law are a profound, unsettling truth. Centuries later, the language of shame still lingers, imprisons gossip and public outrage. The Middle Ages never truly left us, its enduring influence subtly shaping our understanding of justice, punishment, and social control. A haunting reminder that the ancient fears and customs, though transformed, continue to resonate in the very fabric of contemporary society. Imagine the air, crisp and clean, thick with the subtle scent of ink, polished wood, and the pervasive aroma of modern institutions, mingled with the faint tang of unspoken judgments. The sounds are no longer the sharp crack of a whip or the clang of a church bell summoning judgment. They include the low murmur of news reports, the hushed tones of public discussion, and the uneasy silence that follows a modern condemnation. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets, now replaced by the glow of screens, illuminates faces caught between outrage and a familiar, deep-seated fear. Modern legal systems, with their emphasis on due process, individual rights, and the abolition of most corporal punishments, represent a significant departure from medieval justice. Yet the underlying human impulses that shaped those ancient laws, the desire for order, for retribution, for deterrence, and for social control, remain potent. Listen to the low murmur of public outrage, fueled by media reports of a heinous crime, demanding harsh punishment, swift justice. hear the hushed whispers of gossip, spreading through communities, tearing down reputations, even in the absence of formal legal proceedings. See the stark, imposing walls of modern prisons, physically removing offenders from society, their confinement a different form of banishment. Centuries later, the language of shame still lingers, in prisons, gossip, and public outrage. While the pillory and whipping post are gone, public shaming persists in new forms. The intense media scrutiny of criminal trials, the viral spread of scandalous information online, the public condemnation of individuals deemed to have violated social or moral norms. The modern thirst for public exposure, for visible disgrace, echoes the medieval theatre of punishment. Prisons, though ostensibly rehabilitative, still serve a profound function of removal and social isolation, much like medieval banishment. The mark of a criminal record, a public identifier of past transgression, can be as permanent and debilitating as a medieval branding iron, limiting opportunities, creating a lifelong stigma. Gossip, a powerful tool of social control in medieval villages, remains a pervasive force in modern communities, capable of destroying reputations, enforcing conformity, and shaping public opinion, often outside the strictures of formal law. The fear of social ostracism, of collective judgment, is an ancient fear that has simply adapted to new forms. The Middle Ages never truly left us. The fundamental human impulse to judge, to punish, to reinforce social norms through visible consequences continues to shape our legal and social systems. The precise methods may have changed, but the underlying mechanisms of shame and power, of deterrence and social control, remain subtly embedded in our collective consciousness. The shadows in modern law are a pervasive, fundamental reality, transforming the brutal spectacle of medieval justice into an enduring legacy of fear. It is a calm, haunting descent into a world where humiliation was the law and public death was a brutal truth. The faint echo of silence whispers through empty squares, forever tethered to the enduring memory of past terrors, marking the subtle yet profound influence of medieval laws on the very fabric of contemporary society, where the past, in its strange wisdom, continues to shape our present. The echo of the bell. The medieval age, with its strange laws, its public spectacles of shame, and its brutal assertions of power, might seem a distant, barbaric chapter in human history, long since relegated to the shadows of memory. But the profound impact of those centuries, the intricate tapestry of their fears, customs, and laws, continues to resonate. The echo of the bell is a timeless legacy. The bell that once summoned crowds for judgment now rings for peace. But its echo, that deep, trembling sound, still carries through time, a pervasive, chilling reminder that the hidden laws of the past, the ancient fears they embodied, continue to subtly shape our present, an enduring whisper in the collective human consciousness. Imagine the air, crisp and clean, thick with the subtle scent of old stone, damp earth, and the pervasive aroma of memory mingling with the low hum of modern life. The sounds are no longer the sharp crack of a whip or the clang of iron shackles. They include the gentle, melodic peal of a church bell, the murmur of modern voices, and the profound, almost ethereal stillness that sometimes falls over a historic city. Fading candlelight over cobblestone streets, now replaced by electric glows, illuminates a world where the past and present intertwine. The church bell, which had once summoned villagers to witness brutal punishments, to hear pronouncements of judgment, to mourn the condemned, now typically rings for more peaceful purposes. It calls to worship, marks the hours, celebrates joyous occasions, or simply chimes a beautiful melody across the landscape. Its voice, once imbued with the terror of impending retribution, is now a symbol of continuity, of spiritual comfort, of communal harmony. Listen to the gentle, melodic peal of the church bell, its resonant sound carrying on the wind, a soothing presence in the modern air. Hear the subtle shifts in its cadence, its tone, its lingering vibrations, and remember the countless generations who heard a similar sound, but with vastly different meanings. See the ancient stone church still standing, its steeple reaching for the sky, its bell a physical link to a past both brutal and profoundly influential. The bell that once summoned crowds for judgment now rings for peace, but its echo, that deep, trembling sound, still carries through time. The memory of those ancient laws, of the public shame, of the harsh power they represented, remains. It is an echo, not a direct shout, but a subtle hum beneath the surface of our modern understanding of justice and society. The medieval emphasis on public judgment, on communal condemnation, on the visual spectacle of punishment continues to linger in our contemporary world. The desire for public outrage, the scrutiny of individuals in the media, the profound impact of social ostracism, these are modern manifestations of ancient impulses shaped by the pervasive fear of collective disapproval. The lessons of those strange laws, of the delicate balance between order and individual freedom, between punishment and mercy, continue to inform our ongoing debates about justice. The recognition that power, whether secular or spiritual, can be arbitrary and cruel, is a wisdom gleaned from centuries of medieval experience. The Middle Ages never truly left us. Its unwritten codes, its superstitions, its profound fears, all contributed to the intricate tapestry of human society. The echo of the bell, that deep, trembling sound, is a constant, subtle reminder of this enduring legacy. The bell that once summoned crowds for judgment now rings for peace. But its echo in that deep, trembling sound still carries through time. The echo of the bell is a pervasive, fundamental reality in the memory of medieval law, transforming the brutal spectacle of past justice into an enduring legacy of fear. It is a calm, haunting descent into a world where humiliation was the law and public death was a brutal truth. The faint echo of silence whispers through empty squares, forever tethered to the enduring memory of past terrors, marking the subtle yet profound influence of medieval laws on the very fabric of contemporary society, where the past, in its strange wisdom, continues to shape our present, and the bell eternally tolls for us all.